If women remember that once upon a time we sang with the tongues of seals and flew with the wings of swans, that we forged our own paths through the dark forest while creating a community of its many inhabitants, then we will rise uprooted like trees. These evocative words are from If Women Rose Rooted by Sharon Blackie, and they're part of Sharon's email signature. So everyone who gets an email from her gets washed in this rich, redolent imagery. Good evening and welcome to all. The Women's Spirituality and East-West Psychology programs are truly thrilled to host Dr. Sharon Blackie as she presents Women, the Anima Mundi, and the Celtic Otherworld. I'm Annette Williams, chairperson of the Women's Spirituality PhD program and Women, Gender, Spirituality, and Social Justice Master's program. Much thanks to Debashish Banerjee, chairperson of East-West Psychology. Special thanks to Violetta Krasnik, Women's Spirituality Program Coordinator, who's standing in the back. Stefan Julik, East-West Psychology Program Manager, and to Jonathan Kay, East-West Psychology PhD student and tech guru, for their help in organizing this evening.
Thank you.
Dr. Sharon Blackie is an award-winning writer of fiction and nonfiction, including The Long Delirious Burning Blue, If Women Rose Rooted, The Enchanted Life, and the very recently published Foxfire Wolfskin. Dr. Blackie is recognized internationally for her work on cultivating the mythic imagination. She's a mythologist with a specialization in Celtic studies, and a psychologist who has specialized both in neuroscience and narrative. Her unique approach to working with myth, fairy tales, and folklore highlights the insights these traditions can offer us into authentic and meaningful ways of being, which are founded on a return to the native wisdom traditions of the West and on cultivating a deep sense of belonging to the places we inhabit. At this time, I would like to invite East-West Psychology core faculty, Dr. Craig Chalquist, to say a few words.
Thank you.
Good evening. Some years ago, a friend of mine named Linda Bizzell contacted me and said, "Are you aware that there's somebody who is working with myth and ecology and deep psychology and ecofeminism and eco-spirituality and a number of important things?" And I said, "Really? Who?" And she told me about Dr. Sharon Blackie. So I actually bought some of her books, but I didn't immediately launch in because I knew that I needed to have some space and time, because I already felt that I wasn't just going to read her, that I needed to study and appreciate her work, and for that you need some space. And at the time this all happened, I was busy, so and you know, as academics often are, so I went, okay, I need a little timeline to figure out here so that I can start working there. That was my idea anyway. So one of the things I was up to was a group of us put together a journal called Eminence, the Journal of Story, Myth, and Folklore, and we sent out a call for articles. And so Dr. Blackie sent us an article for that first edition, and it was on Celtic mythology and ecofeminism. And it landed on my desk, and I went, I guess the time is now. So I read it and went, wow. And it wasn't just, I could go on about how much I appreciated her work, but then my part would turn into an hour and she would get 5 minutes, so I'm not going to do that. But I just wanted to briefly say, by way of an introduction, that one of the things I most appreciate about her work, even beyond making those connections, or rather in clear and elegant language revealing what these underlying connections are, is that when you use the stories and the ideas in her work to look at life and relationships and how you are with yourself, you soon find yourself, even when the truths are hard ones, in a place of enchantment. And her book, The Enchanted Life, has the apt title for that. So I knew as soon as I saw the title for her presentation tonight that there would be plenty of enchantment to go around. And I really think we need some, because we're facing so many hard truths today. So I so much appreciate her sense of how the stories are not only relevant, the old stories are relevant to the conflicts and dilemmas that we face today, but the creative use that can be made of those, which she so ably demonstrates in how she works. So with that, please welcome Dr. Sharon Blackie.
So that was quite an introduction, no pressure or anything. And I am absolutely delighted to be here because the idea that there is a whole program devoted to women's spirituality is very exciting to me. There is no such thing in my part of the world. There really isn't very much on myth, actually. Certainly as it's combined with depth psychology and ecology and the kind of things that we're all passionate about. You really can't find it in the UK or in Ireland. So to be here in a whole institution that's got such richness is really very exciting. And I also want to say that I have in the past several years also been very inspired by Craig's work on terror psychology. So if there's anybody in this room who isn't familiar with that, I encourage you to go and find out about it, because it adopts a very place-based, grounded approach to myths and stories, which is part of my own passion. And really what I want to leave you with tonight, I guess, is a sense that the Celtic tradition, which I'll give a little bit of an introduction to in a minute, that I come from is nothing if not grounded in place. Without a grounding in place, it has no meaning. It is the antithesis of a transcendental mythology. It is all rooted in place. And to me, in a world where we seem to be spend half our lives floating at least a foot above the ground rather than actually rooted in it, this is something that is really, really very important, and something that we really need to get back in whatever ways we possibly can. So, Celtic mythology. I often say that there is more nonsense written about Celtic mythology, probably than any other subject I know, with maybe the exception of psychology, so we're really doing well here tonight. Great. I don't know why that is, except it's very complicated. And it's very different from the kind of mythologies that people know a lot about. It's very different from Greek mythology and Roman mythology in various ways. The reason, it's very complex in some ways, and simpler in others, I suppose. Where it differs, and I think this is one of the reasons why you don't see Celtic mythology as a subject matter in in-depth psychology type programs, is that it doesn't lend itself to easy definition of archetypes like the Greek and Roman mythology does. Okay? To me, that makes it very much more interesting, and I hope that I'll have convinced you by the time I've finished that the things it has instead are very much more relevant to the times. Because if I could do anything in the rest of my life, it would be to persuade some depth psychologists to leave the Greek and Roman stuff alone. It's been done. And delve into some of the mythologies, like the Celtic mythologies and other indigenous mythologies around the world, which are aimed at rooting us in our place, not in some transcendental Olympian heaven type of thing. So we don't have a pantheon in the same way, and I'd just like to make a couple of general comments up front about it. We don't have gods of this and goddesses of that, no matter what you hear or read on the internet. The Celtic deities are intensely rooted in place and tribe and cannot be extricated from them. So they may have certain characteristics. For example, the Morrigan, who is often portrayed as a goddess of war, the raven goddess who often appears on battlefields, is often called a goddess of war. She really isn't. She's a goddess of life, birth, death, and everything in between, and that means that when there's war, she appears on the battlefield. So there's always an attempt to kind of categorize these things in ways that people are comfortable with, you know, in ways that they've already started to think about mythologies and pantheons, and it really, really doesn't apply. It is intensely place-based, as I'm going to go on to discuss. So one of the reasons why I am so, or two of the reasons why I am so passionate about the mythology from Celtic countries, apart from the fact that these are the lands of my birth and my own heritage, is that they show us a world in which women have voices, and in a world in which women need to find their voices, they are particularly relevant today. And as I say, the second thing is they show us a world in which women are inextricably linked with a land and place, and we very much need this today. So those are the two overarching themes, I would say, of Celtic mythology, and I'll expand upon that in the next little while. But to begin with, what I want to do is to give a little bit of background about what I mean when I say Celtic mythology. What is that? Where does it come from? Where does it exist? First, the word Celtic, and I'm not going to go into that because that would be a whole, just in any detail, because that would be a whole discussion all of its own. When we say Celtic, we mean the countries where there is a living Celtic language spoken today. Now, there are lots of other countries in Europe that once upon a time spoke Celtic languages, but they're not considered to be Celtic nations. So Celtic is Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the Isle of Man, Brittany, and Cornwall. Okay, those are the official Celtic nations, and when we talk about Celtic mythology, these are the countries that we are talking about. Most of those countries do not have a body of written texts that reflect any thinking from the pre-Christian era, with the notable exception of Ireland. Okay, so when I talk about Celtic mythology, I'm mostly talking about Ireland, and I'll probably revert in a bit to talking about Irish mythology. There is a little bit also in the Welsh tradition, but really not as much. Ireland was unique, okay, so it's right out there on the west of Europe. You know, so from the European mainland, you've got to cross the UK, then you've got to get to Ireland, and although there were surprisingly busy trading routes, nevertheless it was left untouched by certain cultural influences on the European mainland, and it has a very, very different tradition. When Christianity came to Ireland, it did not come in the hierarchical Episcopalian, bishopric kind of perspective. It came with a monastic tradition, so it's community focused, it's tribal focused, it's place focused, just like the culture was, and so that meant that in the early years of Christianity coming to Ireland, there was a slightly different flavour that very much reflected the culture of the country at the time, and it was only later in the Reformation that all of that began to change. So we had a few centuries where, although the idea of a Celtic Christianity is disputed, this aspect of it is not, where monks, scribes basically, in the monasteries, wrote down in a unique and curious collaboration with the Irish bards and Fili, the poets, wrote down the old stories, poems and sagas that had existed before Christianity came along. That did not happen to anything remotely like the same extent, if at all, anywhere else in Europe, so it's unique in that respect. Now, they could not help but mess with it. Okay, so they didn't write it down exactly as it was. So you find all kinds of really weird situations where, you're in Ireland, in ancient Ireland, and there's all of these warriors and heroes, and then they're talking about the granddaughter of Noah and things like that. So they seem to have to insert some odd Christian motifs. But generally speaking, the stories are believed largely to reflect the stories that were told before Christians came. However, one thing is really important to understand, that these stories were written down by Christian monks. They wrote the stories down. They did not write down the religious beliefs and practices that the Druids would have been responsible for, because that was a competing religion. So what we know about the old spiritual practices are things that we glean, that we infer, if you like, from the old sagas and poetry, and it may or may not be accurate. However, we can get some very clear indications of cosmologies and of worldviews, and all of those worldviews are intensely earth-centered. So Ireland was writing things down basically in the 6th century. That's really very, very early for Europe. In Wales we have a few odd documents that are a little bit later and quite a lot of poetry, but most of the cosmology, most of what we can say about the worldview comes from that vast body of Irish documents, some of which, during the Viking raids, a lot of them were taken to the European mainland for protection. A lot of them ended up in Austria and Germany. So, the realm of Celtic studies actually began in Germany in the past century or more, because they had a lot of the documents there. But because a lot of them are in bad shape, it's an intensely difficult language, even compared to modern Irish. A lot of them still haven't been translated, actually. There's a whole body of evidence sitting in vaults in parts of Germany and other countries in Europe that are still waiting for someone to come along. There just aren't enough people that can translate them. Nevertheless, there is a huge body. So, I'd like to introduce you then to a few threads that are relevant to this whole concept of women and the land and tribe mostly from now on. I'm mostly going to be talking about the Irish and the Scottish mythology. I should have said that although Scotland doesn't have any pre-Christian texts, you see a lot of the same old stories, a lot of the same characters in the Scottish Gaelic tradition as appear in the Irish Gaelic tradition. Not surprisingly, apart from the fact that there was the same language, there was a huge amount of trade between Scotland and Ireland, particularly on the west coast, which remains Gaelic and Gaelic speaking to this day. And so it's not surprising that there would have been a lot of overlap. So when I come to one particular character, we'll find a lot from the Scottish tradition as well. Irish mythology, then, is profoundly goddess-centered. Okay, and that's not just my wishful thinking. There are many crusty, elderly gentlemen, folklorists, and literary experts scattered throughout the universities in Ireland who say so and actually write it down, much to their chagrin, I think, sometimes. Because it is still a very patriarchal society, no matter what you read in the press these days. It's getting more and more progressive. But it's just there. There are, clearly in the Irish tradition, there are gods as well as goddesses, if we want to call them that. And it's not always obvious that we should, but that's another story. But they tend to have smaller roles, and I would say that there are only 2 or 3 of them. The Dagda, who was the father of a lot of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the characters that we now think of, the immortals that we now think of as gods and goddesses. The Dagda crops up every now and again, not doing very much, but he crops up now and again. Lu, a character called Lu, who appears throughout Celtic Europe, who is often called a sun god. He wasn't. His name just means light. That doesn't mean he's a sun god. He appears in quite a lot of places. And a character called Manannán mac Lia, who is often called a sea god. He isn't, but he appears in the sea a lot. So you can, I guess that's a little bit more understandable. So these are 3 kind of the male deities who do crop up quite a lot in the stories, but almost all of the stories, when something happens, it is triggered off by an otherworldly woman. And we'll have a couple of examples of that in a moment. So they're profoundly goddess-centered. In a way that the male deities were not, pretty much all of the female deities are specific to a particular place, to a particular part of Ireland. So, for example, who would we have heard of? Bridget might be the exception, actually. You see Bridget cropping up pretty much all over Ireland, although there would have been local variants of her. The character that we often hear called Queen Maeve of Connaught is from Connaught. So the west of Ireland. There would be a character called Macha, who would be in Ulster in the north of Ireland, and so it would go. So all of these different female deities who are associated with specific places embody a quality of the goddess of the land which is called sovereignty. So they're often called sovereignty goddesses. Now again, sovereignty in the Irish tradition, Celtic tradition, has absolutely nothing to do with personal power. It is not about us, it's about the land. And so sovereignty is a particular old Irish word called flachius, F-L-A-T-H-I-U-S, if anybody's taking notes and cares, which literally means sovereignty, like in the context of rulership, okay? And she was called, the goddess of the land was called the goddess of sovereignty because she was the one who determined who would be the appropriate ruler of the land. And the appropriate ruler of the land was the king who would lead the people to live in balance and harmony with the land. Okay, so I'm going to come on to a story about that in a second, so let's just park that. So all over Ireland, in each area of the country, a different female would be acknowledged, would be honoured, who represented that land and represented the tribe, the people in that land, and who was effectively the goddess of sovereignty. She was the one who chose the king. And it's important to understand that also in an evening where I'm going to be very much focusing on female voices, that this does not mean that male qualities were not important too. A good king was absolutely critical to the health and well-being of the people and of the land. Okay? And the king had specific qualities that were revered. And the main one, and I can't remember the actual word for it, I've got a bit of a blank on it for some reason, but it was a quality of kind of like the king's truth or the king's justice. And this was the idea that the king had to be able to display good judgment, literally. And this wasn't that, you know, he'd give the right sentences to a criminal necessarily, as he was the one who could discern. It was a discerning characteristic. He was the one who could discern what was good for the people in the context of being good for the land as well. And so this quality of right judgment in the king was what the goddess of sovereignty was always looking for, so that the people would be always in tune, in balance and harmony with the land. And that quality of discernment, of clarity of judgment, was kind of like, if you like, the masculine component of this mythology, which was just as important. But I'm just going to focus, for the sake of this talk, on the female qualities too. So this idea of the goddess of sovereignty choosing the rightful king who would live in balance and harmony with the land was so fundamental to the Irish tradition that right up until the 16th century in Ireland, there were rites of sacred kingship where the king would marry the goddess of the land. Okay? And there were all kinds of contraptions involved in this. Sometimes they would bathe in mare's broth because the horse was often associated with a lot of female deities, all kinds of rituals and what have you. But it was all about this symbolic sacred marriage between the king representing the people and the land as represented by the goddess of sovereignty. So this is absolutely fundamental to the Irish tradition. We believe there are threads of it too in the Welsh tradition, and we believe that it was probably Celtic-wide. It's just that, you know, the old stories don't exist, unfortunately, in some of the other countries. But since it was so fundamental in Ireland, and since we see traces of it in Wales and Scotland, it almost certainly was there. So any analysis of any Celtic myth or character that does not take this into account is probably flawed. And it's one of the many problems, and I won't rant, it's always a temptation of comparative mythology, you know, when you expect one mythology to be like another. So you look at the Irish mythology in the context of what you know about Greek and Roman mythology, which seems on the surface of it like a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and comparative mythology is very important, but if it's not combined with some depth knowledge of where, literally, where the mythology rises out of, then you're going to get some stuff wrong. And to me, the most fundamental misinterpretations of Celtic mythology come from a lack of knowledge that that is at the heart of it, that that is fundamental to it. So, a story, those of you who have read If Women Rose Rooted will know this story. If you haven't, I'm going to tell it to you because it tells us what happened. It tells us why this relationship between people and the land is so important, and it tells us what happens when the relationship breaks down. And this is a story which is likely to be the oldest story that we have in full in the Grail tradition. Okay, now I could go on about the Grail tradition as well, and I don't think I'm going to have very much time to do that this evening, although I might come back to it if I find I do. The Grail tradition is often presented as originating in the 13th century in France, particularly with the work of Chrétien de Troyes and Perceval, the Comte de Grail, and then the other French romances, and then finally the German romance by Wolfram von Eschenbach, Perceval. It actually, oddly enough, also had quite a long history, which is often ignored by all of the many Jungian psychologists who have written vast books about the Grail tradition, very much missing the point that actually it almost certainly originated in the Celtic countries long, long before the 13th century. And this story that I'm going to talk about nevertheless appeared in writing. The only place it appears in writing is in Chrétien de Troyes' Perceval. Now, I don't know whether you know, but Chrétien died before he finished that story, and so what happened was 4 other people finished it, provided their versions of the ends of it, and they're usually called the continuation, except one of them is not a continuation, it is kind of a prologue, and it's called the elucidation. And it tells a slightly different version of the story of how the Grail came to be in the Grail castle and how the land came to be a wasteland. And it's a very interesting story. It has been largely traced. None of these things can ever be done fully. We're making assumptions, but it is believed that this story came from Wales, with the Welsh and Breton storytelling communication, which, obviously they're both Brythonic languages, they both had similar stories, they both had similar languages, and so Welsh storytellers would go very often to Brittany, Breton storytellers would go very often to Wales. It's believed that the Welsh stories ended up in Brittany and then came into the Norman, more traditional French romantic tradition in that way. This one has been traced to a particular storyteller who is called various things that look like Bleheris. Sometimes the H is missing, it's all spelt in different ways in different manuscripts, who was known to be a Welsh storyteller who passed into Brittany and into Normandy. So it's believed to be part of an old Welsh tradition. It actually probably dates back to an Irish story as well, which means that the Grail story probably originated in Ireland, and this is not as crazy as it sounds. There are whole books that have been written about this. Again, none of that ever appears in most of the books that have been written about the Grail from a depth psychology perspective, which is a pity, because there's a lot of richness there that could enhance our understanding of what it means. So this story, the elucidation, I should say, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, that the story of Perceval and the Grail goes that the land had become a wasteland because of a wound in the genitals, or thigh, depending on which version of the manuscript you read, of a king who is usually called the Fisher King, or the Good Fisher in some stories. Okay, the world, because the Celtic tradition the tradition was that the king had to be whole. Okay, it seems unfair, but the king had to be whole. If the king wasn't whole, if the king was wounded, he couldn't rule. And because the king was so tied up with the fate of the land and represented the land as well as the people in a sense, a wound like that would mean that the land would reflect the wound of the king. So you have a wasteland, you have a wounded king. Perceval, who's often portrayed, it was always portrayed as a very callow youth, goes off searching for the Grail, I'm really cutting this down and making it very, very short. He finds the Grail. He comes to a castle, which is the Grail castle. He sees this strange procession where women are bearing the Grail, and there's also a spear and there's a shield and all kinds of other contraptions as well. And he doesn't, the first time around, he doesn't ask the question that must be asked, which is the major motif in the Grail story. He gets a second chance, he asks it again, the right question, which happens to be, what ails thee? Okay, there's a whole other story there. He doesn't have to kill any dragons, he doesn't have to go on a hero's journey or any great adventure, he just has to show compassion to the wounded king. Another story for the times. Anyway, so he says, what ails thee? He cures by doing that, the king is cured and the land no longer becomes a wasteland. In the elucidation, which is the older, let's just agree that it's probably Welsh, maybe Irish tradition, it is not a wound in the genitals of a man that causes the wasteland to occur. The story goes that once upon a time, the southwest of England and Wales was called the Kingdom of Logres. And Logres was a very rich and very beautiful land. Everybody lived in balance and harmony with the land. And one of the sources of richness and beauty in the land were all of the wonderful things that came from the otherworldly court of the Fisher King. Now, the Fisher King's court, which was an otherworldly court, could still be found in those days along the riverbanks, normally, if you were lucky to happen upon it at the right time, under the right circumstances. And from the Fisher King's court came all of the riches, all of the food, all of the beautiful treasures, all of the fine clothing, all of the wild things of the land. The other thing that was very special about the Kingdom of Logres was that it had a network of holy wells, of sacred wells, as we would say. And it was believed in those days that wells, the water that came out of wells, came from the otherworld, and that this was the life-giving, nourishing force of the otherworld that came into the land and made everything good. And these wells were tended by maidens, by otherworldly maidens, who would come out of the wells, and if anybody should be passing by, if anybody should be travelling through the country who was in need of food or drink, the maidens would come out of the wells and they would offer them a drink from their grails and some food from a fine golden platter. And this was the service that the otherworldly women gave to the people of the land. And they were respected for doing that, and everything was fine, everything was good. And it all went very well until one day a king became ruler of the Kingdom of Logres, who did not understand the necessary the relationship between people and the land, who did not understand that the balance had to be kept, that the relationship went both ways. And Amangon was passing through the land one day. He came to a well. The otherworldly maiden came out of the well, offered him food from the Grail, offered him from the platter, offered him a drink of otherworldly well water from the Grail. And Amangon threw the vessels to one side, took the well maiden and raped her while his men looked on. And seeing what he had done, all of his men went out through the country and they raped all of the well maidens. And so the document says the otherworldly women did not any longer come up from the wells, and the voices of the wells were lost, and the land became a wasteland. And the court of the Fisher King could no longer be found. It wasn't open to people anymore. So it's really very interesting that the very oldest story, the very oldest Grail story, it is what is done to women, and it is that betrayal of the relationship between people and the land that causes the consequences, that causes the wasteland. One of the very oldest fundamental stories in our mythology tells us that we have to keep in balance in relationship with the land, as well as respecting that feminine principle, which is otherworldly. So this whole question of the otherworld and the land is something I'd like to just spend a few minutes on, because this is also absolutely fundamental to Celtic mythology, particularly, again, to Irish mythology. The otherworld in our tradition is not some transcendental place up there or out there. It's not actually really a place at all. It is absolutely entangled with, entwined with the land. It's inextricable from. It's kind of another way of looking. Okay? And I wanted to give you another very brief story which illustrates this, I think, in the best way in the whole Celtic canon. Just a very brief one, and some of you may have heard of Imrama Bran, the Voyage of Bran, or the Adventures of Bran. Bran is a character that pops up quite often in the Irish stories. He was generally portrayed as the king of a kingdom which now would encompass the city of Derry in Ulster, around about Lough Foyle. And anyway, Bran was out hunting one day in the woods with his men, and to cut another very long story short, he was accosted by a very beautiful otherworldly woman carrying a silver branch, which tinkled and had apples on it, and all of the other motifs that are associated with the otherworld. Anyway, she follows Bran home. When they get there, to cut out lots of odds and sods that aren't really relevant, when she gets there, she says to Bran, "I am the queen of Tir na Man, the land of women. And this is an island way out in the Western Sea, and it only has women on it. Wouldn't you like to come and visit us, Bran?" So not surprisingly, the next morning, Bran and his men hot-foot it down to the seashore. They all get in their coracles and they paddle for all that their life is worth across the Western Sea, looking for Tir na Man, the Isle of Women. They have various adventures on the way, but the one that I want to point out here is at some point while they're in the sea, out of the sea rises Manannán mac Lia, and this character who may or may not be a sea god that I mentioned earlier on. And Manannán says to Bran, "You think you're in a boat, don't you?" Bran says, "Well, yes, actually I do." "You think you're on the sea, don't you?" "Yep." And Manannán says, "Well, in the way that I see it, you are riding a golden-wheeled chariot across the flower-filled plains of Magmel. And you think that's a wave, don't you?" Bran says, "Yes, it's a wave." And Manannán says, "No, that is the hill of," and I can't remember the name of it or whatever. And what Manannán goes on to do in the following piece of text is make it very, very clear to Bran that this is just a way of perceiving. The other world, well, not just, but the other world is a way of perceiving. It's like a veil that you pierce, and if you can see properly, then you get to see through the veil of the physical reality into the other world as well. So it's not a separate place, it's entangled with this one, and you can find your way to the other world through this world, and this world only. Sometimes, some places it's easier to be found than others, normally kind of like liminal zones, threshold zones, so you know, at the edge of a river or the seashore, what we call in Scotland the Black Shore, which is where all the seaweed gathers between the land and the sea. It's called the Black Shore, that's a threshold zone. You can find it there very often. Sometimes at the bottom of lakes or through hollow hills, or sometimes by traversing a barrier of mist. It doesn't really matter where. You can happen upon it at any time if you are called to do so. At certain times of year, the veil is believed to be particularly thin, so Samhain, which we would now probably call Halloween, and Beltane, the other major festivals, the veil would be believed to be thin. And humans can be called to the other world for particular purposes. It's often the case, you know, the old sagas are normally situations where a kind of heroic figure is called to the other world by an otherworldly woman, in the same way that Bran was called to the other world by an otherworldly woman, to fulfill some function, to learn something, to take something back, or, you know, whatever it may be. As a slight aside, it would be very easy then to think of these stories as hero tales. They are and they're not, in the sense that, you know, these are arguably heroes that are being called to the other world, but they're rarely there to swashbuckle or to kill dragons. They're normally there to learn something quite subtle, and then they get sent back again. To me, the whole idea that they are heroic tales is a misnomer. More often than not, these guys are going to the other world in service of the land. Okay, so whatever they're doing is in service of the land. Often it's because something is needed by the tribe. It's because the goddess of the land needs a hero, needs help. She's she's embattled and she needs someone to help her in order that she can continue to support the land. So they're not really hero tales in the way that you might normally think of them. In a sense, then, this idea of the otherworld in the Irish, the idea of the goddess of the land in the Irish tradition, the goddess of sovereignty, who is very much associated with these particular places and particular tribes. There is a sense in which I think of her as kind of like a representative of the Anima Mundi, kind of the world soul, as manifested in a particular place, in a particular people. So that she is so associated with the land, she is so associated with the other world, you can't tease the two of them apart. And so to me, these deities are local representations, manifestations, if you like, almost like spirits of place, but a little bit more than that. I would see them as manifestations of kind of a world psyche as represented in a particular place with all of its uniqueness and its diversity. The other world, because it is a place that is filled with archetypal beings, not just gods and goddesses, but there are monsters in there, there are shape-shifting characters, there are all kinds of archetypal motifs and themes and stuff happening. It bears a lot of resemblance to the old Sufi concept which Henri Corbin wrote about of the mundus imaginalis, or the imaginal world. And so I do see it very much in that context, having studied both in some intensity. The other world was, the stories of the other world and conceptions of the other world was the subject of my master's degree, a focus, of my work in my master's degree in Celtic studies. They bear similar kinds of relationships and similar kinds of functions to the extent that we can discern that, because of course we do not, unlike the ancient Sufis, have a vast repository of cosmology and of religious and spiritual beliefs. So we're gleaning this from those old stories, sagas and poems, but it is very, very clear to me that that is what is represented, and people are being invited into the other world, into the imaginal world, in order to interact with these archetypal beings, in order that something in them may transform, in order that they may transform the land and reinvigorate the land and people's relationship with the land almost always. And this is a very, very clear thread throughout most of those old stories, which again isn't very often understood. And so I've seen some very kind of shallow interpretations, of a lot of the old stories. The stories of Finn McCool, for example, is often portrayed as a, popular culture as a swashbuckling hero. If anything, he was a profoundly shamanic character. Huge threads of shamanic motifs in all of the Finn stories. And it's also important to say that these stories, the Finn stories particularly, are not just texts, they're not just kind of set in stone. I live in the west of Ireland in the Gaeltacht, which is the one of the Irish-speaking areas. These stories are still being told around fires today. They're still part of the oral tradition, they're still growing, they're still changing with the times, and that's really very important. And they have all of these threads, and everybody just takes them for granted. The other world, shape-shifting, all of these tropes are just part of what is being told to kids and to adults around the fire. So it's very much a living tradition, and for that reason alone, it seems to me that it's important to understand where that tradition is rooted, so that it is respected still, and so that it is understood, rather than these very shallow ways of telling these stories that a lot of storytellers who don't have the depth seem to do these days. Now, so that's the basic context, and some of the concepts of the other world, of the goddess of the land, women associated with the land. There is one character that I'd like to spend the rest of the time on, who really typifies these qualities in a very, very powerful and very, very wonderful way. Celtic mythology does not have any recorded creation myth. We don't have anything that explains how the universe the cosmos in general came to be. There would have been one, of course there would have been one, but the Christian priests were not going to write that down because they kind of had their own creation there, and they liked it a bit better, I'm sure. And however, we did have, and do have, very much in the folk tradition today, a character called the Cailleach. And Cailleach is the Irish and Scottish Gaelic, we say Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic, in case you're wondering, just to be difficult, word for old woman. It literally means old woman, Cailleach, old woman. It comes from the Latin, I forgot what it is, something like, anyway, which means veil. So she clearly at some stage was conceived of being a veiled old woman, but she's not normally portrayed that way in popular culture. Before I get on to telling you a little bit about it, there is an interesting distinction to make here for the scholars of myth. Most of the characters that I've been talking about, the goddesses of sovereignty, Lu, Bran, Manon and Maclear, all of those kind of characters, are written down in texts, okay? So in a sense, and those texts changed when they were written down by the Christian monks, and they changed in various iterations as they were written down again, and the manuscripts were copied over the centuries. Because they're, in a sense, all we know of them is that they're literary constructs, with a few notable examples because they appear in the archaeology, on inscriptions and so on, like Bridget, like Lu. We do not know whether those characters in the old Irish stories that were written down actually were the gods and goddesses of the people. They could just be literary figures, you know, and probably almost certainly many of them were. We do not know. However, there are a couple of very powerful characters who were never really very big in the literary texts, but live on today in folklore. And these characters are believed to be older, pre-Celtic, you know, pre the people that came there in the Indo-European traditions, and almost, well, for sure, there is no question about it, and for sure were venerated by the people. The Cailleach is a representative of an old woman, haggish giantess figure associated with rock, who appears in many, many Northern European mythologies, and actually a few Southern European mythologies as well. Think of the giant troll women in Scandinavia, just as an example. There are examples in Malta and there's the Mediterranean as well, but it's particularly strong there. We know that she was venerated by the people, always, even though we don't have specific practices that would be associated with her or rituals, because her name is everywhere in the landscape. So there are many, many hills, particularly, and rocky places throughout both Ireland and Scotland that are named after the Cailleach. That's normally a bit of a giveaway, you know, if characters actually appear in the landscape, and stories are still told about them today, and stories have been recorded in the oral tradition about the Cailleach ever since recording of oral tradition began, both in Scotland and in Ireland. Everywhere you go, pretty much, there is a Cailleach story, or several. And she has clearly, you know, moved with the times in the way that all of the best folklore does. So the Cailleach would have been very old, and she would for sure have been one of the characters that probably was seriously venerated by the local people. So she is an old woman who created and shaped the land. There are stories in both Scotland and Ireland about her, this giant figure, dancing across the landscape, carrying stones in her apron, and where she lets the stones fall is where the hills and mountains fall. She is portrayed with a hammer, where she shapes the valleys between the mountains to her preference. She is portrayed there are two different characteristics. There are two different types of Cailleach, one in Ireland and one in Scotland, and this is another reason why we believe that she was older, that she really was venerated, because she reflects the landscape. In Scotland, which is a harsher, much more mountainous country than Ireland, she is inimical to humans often, and she is very harsh, very fierce, and associated with winter. In Ireland, she is not. you wouldn't want to mess with her. You know, you don't always get away with very much as a human being. But it is a softer country, generally speaking, not always, in all places, but in most places. And she is associated with domestic animals as well as wild animals. So that it's slightly, so she takes on the shape and the character of the land in each country, and the stories that are told about her are different and reflect that. In Scotland, then, she's portrayed with running across the hilltops and mountaintops with her staff, and where she strikes the ground with her staff, snow and ice springs up. So she is very much associated with the seasons, with harsh winds and storms in Scotland. She is portrayed as riding on the back of a wolf, sometimes with a herd of wild pigs running behind her. She kept a herd of fairy cattle, a deer. Okay, so she kept a herd of deer, wild creatures. In Ireland, she kept cows, because the whole Irish economy throughout the entire medieval period was based on cattle. That's what they had. They had lots and lots of green grass, and so cattle was fundamental to everything. That's why there are so many sagas about cattle raids. So she is kind of a wilderness spirit in many ways, and she very much personifies the rocky heights and the hills that are named after her. She, in Scotland particularly, and also in Ireland, but in Scotland particularly, there are many stories about her holding back the tide of humans who want to take too much from the land. So there are stories in a place called, there's never one Cailleach, okay? There are various different Cailleachs in various different regions, and there may well have been not just the Cailleach, but the Cailleach in many different Cailleachs. In a place called Benvrick in Highland Perthshire, there was a very well-known Cailleach who was known to appear before hunters who would be going into the mountains to kill hinds. Do you say hind here? Female deer. A female deer, we call it a hind. A what? A doe, okay. Who would be going to take a female deer during the season when they were pregnant. And she would stop the hunter from taking the pregnant deer and say that if they were very good, she would let them have a stag every now and again in season at the right time. And so this whole sense that she is holding the balance, that she's saying what is enough and what is too much, is threaded throughout the Cailleach folklore in Scotland and, to an extent, slightly lesser extent, curiously, I don't know why that is, in Ireland. So she is the one who represents wild nature and, of course, you know, is accepting of human habitation on the land, but isn't going to let the land be ruined. There are stories about her weeping while the forests are cut down. There are stories about her teaching in Ireland, teaching humans how to thresh corn, you know, how to do good agricultural practices. When I said that the Cailleach, so to me she's a very, very powerful figure. Okay, she is everywhere in our folklore, and this idea that in these times we have this very powerful first old woman. You know, in some of the stories she says, when I was a lass, the ocean was a forest full of trees. So she's old. She is associated with geological time. She's been there since the very, very beginning. She's almost like some kind of geotectonic force of the earth, in a sense. The idea that this old woman, who was there first, who created and shaped the land and who then protected it, is so important, I think, today. As a role model, as a recognition that in our lineage, in our heritage, this is what our people once valued. This is what they saw as important. This is how they saw the world. This is how they saw things shaping up, the necessities by which people lived. The Cailleach, of course, didn't do well in Christian culture, not surprisingly. there's story after story of her being killed off by one Christian saint or priest or another, but it's kind of interesting how she's still there in all the place names, and she's still there in the folklore, and the stories are still being told about her. There's one classic story, which is my very, very favourite one, where according to the different place, part of Ireland where the story is told, it's either St Patrick or St Brandon or some miscellaneous saint, who's heard of the Cailleach, and of course, you know, she's an evil pagan witch to the Christians, and so he, feeling very pleased with himself, he goes and knocks on her door, trying to trick her into revealing her, you know, her true nature, her true self. And he says to the Cailleach, "Well, my old woman, how old are you?" And the Cailleach looks at Saint whoever it might be and says, "Well, for every year that I have been on this earth, I've taken a bullock. And I've butchered the bullock, and I've eaten the bullock. And so if you go into the loft up there and you count the thigh bones, I've always kept the thigh bone of the bullock, if you count the thigh bones, then you'll find out how old I am." And of course the story goes that for days, you know, these bullock thigh bones are being thrown down the stairs, and eventually 3 days later, Saint whoever it is runs out of the front door screaming, and the Cailleach got the last laugh on that one. But very often the stories are about her being overthrown. In my part of the world, there is a story that she was hurled by St Patrick into a very, very deep loch at a particularly beautiful mountain pass, but I think she's probably there still. So we have this vision of the female creative energy which underpins this mythology. And in a sense it's not very surprising, because of course if we think that a lot of these ideas, and we don't know, they may or may not have done, a lot of these tropes came from the Indo-European culture, which was the predecessor, certainly linguistically, to the Celts. And we go back to India, we see that it is actually the female qualities that are creative and active. If we look at the Shakti and Shiva situation, for example, Shakti is the creative energy, she is the mover, whereas Shiva would be the rational, more intellectual, static, both absolutely necessary. What, you know, Shakti without Shiva is chaos, Shiva without Shakti is aridity. So both absolutely necessary, but it is the female principle that is the creative energy. I guess not surprisingly, but we see that very much throughout Celtic mythology. That creative, energetic, kind of like initiatory characteristic of the female characters. I love particularly, as I get older, that she is a model of you know, female elderhood in a way. This sense of just saying no, of standing, of just saying, I won't allow this, you know, this is enough, this is not acceptable, is also, I think, a very, very powerful one for a society which is badly in need of some female elder leadership, I suspect. So she is probably the best example of all, I would say, and the most authentic example from a folkloric perspective of this type of energy. And finally, the last thing that I want to mention is the tendency in the Celtic tradition, and we do see this in the remnant, very much also in the remnants of the Welsh manuscripts, of which there are very, very few, but they're very beautiful. If any of you haven't read the Mabinogi, read it. It's very lovely, fascinating set of stories. Is that these otherworldly women have a very, very high propensity to shapeshift into animal form. Okay, you do occasionally see that with some of the male characters, but women are just doing it all the time. And so, you know, I mentioned earlier the Morrigan, who would be a raven or a crow, depending on how you translate the Old Irish. And there are various other raven and crow shape-shifting goddesses, so that they would as soon appear in crow form as they would in human form. We find a lot of swans. We find a lot of swan maidens or swan women. One or two swan men, but mostly it is a function of otherworldly women. They often appear in the form of swans. We see old women appearing as herons or cranes. And I should say that The two are interchangeable in our mythology because we would have had the Eurasian crane as one of the resident birds, and at the point where it became extinct, the grey heron moved in and basically took over its ecological niche. And although they're different species, of course, they look very similar. And the Irish word cor means both crane and heron, so we tend to use crane and heron interchangeably. But in many, many of the old stories, there is a hag, there is an old woman who shapeshifts into a heron. So birds would be the most common form that an otherworldly woman would take, except she would also take the form of a horse. So we have an awful lot of female deities who would take the form of a horse. There is a thread here, there are several threads here, but I won't go on. Horses were believed to be, because they were swift and because they ran, that they would help carry the soul of the dead to the other world. And so there is that sense of them being otherworldly animals. The birds that are most often, if we leave ravens and crows, which have their own mythology and connotations, the birds, the water birds, the swans and herons are particularly pervasive, I think, because they cross the threshold of three elements. Okay, so they are air, water and earth. And in the Irish tradition, there were three elements. We didn't really talk about four. I mean, clearly there was fire, but they weren't looking at it quite in the same way. So people, for example, would swear by the sky and the sea and the earth. So it was common that they would say, if I lie, you know, may the sky open up before me, may the earth open up and swallow me, may the sea inundate me. So this kind of threefold cosmos pervades the old Irish stories, and of course these birds appear in all of those different places, and so they would have been very, very powerful for that reason, and also believed to be, the heron particularly would have been, the crane would have been believed to guard the gates to the other world because of that particular power. That is so pervasive also in the folklore and fairy tales of the Celtic nations, this idea that women particularly just shapeshift into animals as easy as breathing. And to me it also represents a cosmology, a worldview, in which animal wisdom was seen to be just as important, if not more important, than human wisdom. That sense that they know something that we don't, that they see the world, they are in contact with the world, they are in relationship with the world in a different way from humans, and therefore sometimes we need to access that way of being when our way isn't enough. And so you very often find in the folklore and in the Mabinogi, and one of the oldest stories in the Welsh tradition, has the motif of the oldest animals, so that when people are looking for answers to important questions, and they go to the people in the village, and they go to the oldest person in the village, and then they go to an even older person in the next village, when they still don't have the answer, then they turn to the animals. And they turn to an old animal, and then an older animal, and then the oldest animal of all. And this whole idea that they are the ones who have the answers, who were here often before humans, you know, the idea that they were here, they inhabited the earth before humans did, and so they know things that we don't. So you have a world which is, and it doesn't, the whole idea of an animate world doesn't just extend to the other than human in animal form, it also extends to trees and stones, but I don't have time to go into all of that there. But this whole concept then, to sum up what I'm trying to portray here, is a world which is, as all of the best fairy tales tell us, everything is animate. You know, you're as likely to be addressed by a crow as you are by another human being, where animal wisdom is valued, and women are just as likely to shapeshift into animal form as they are to be in human form, where women, in a very real sense, embody the land, but they embody the land intertwined with the other world, because that's not a transcendental place. The sacred is here. The deities are here. You know, that other world and land cannot be extricated. And to me, again, for challenging times in all kinds of different ways, that whole world view, which is which our ancestors had, for those of us who have that kind of lineage, and for those who don't have Celtic lineage, you see very, very similar things if you look in other European mythologies as well. The reason, as I said, why I think it's not been taken up in with quite as much enthusiasm as the Greek and Roman mythology has. And again, you know, when I was a child, only Greek and Roman stuff was allowed to be mythology. Our stories were just stories. They weren't mythology, they were just stories. It was only Greek and Roman stuff. I hope that I'm encouraging a few people maybe to abandon the Greek and the Roman pantheons and to delve a little bit more deeply into these very profound associations with the natural world, with women particularly giving voice to the earth, being guardians and protectors of the earth in a way that we haven't seen before. I think it's probably about time. So, thank you.
Sorry. Hello? Okay, it's on. So we have some time for questions. Okay. Let's see. There are quite a few questions. So why don't we form a line over here, and I think that's an effective way of doing this. Okay. And I'll bring them to you here. Yeah. Okay. Yes. And so here is our elder and very venerated woman. Already to you first.
Oh, thank you. Question, which is, do we have a dark Indo-European goddess or deity? Because I have not been able to locate that.
A dark?
Yes, as in the Dark Mother, as in
I see.
Grandmothers, which I've got about 150 actually going on, but I've not been able to locate a Celtic or an Indo-European one.
Okay, I'm not familiar with the Indo-European except as it relates to Celtic, but I would say that certainly if you look at the character of the Morrigan, she's a very, very complex character, she's a very ambivalent character. She is actually, to me, she personifies both sides, like the good mother and the bad mother, if you like, in the sense that she is clearly actually a fertility figure. There's a wonderful story about her mating with the Dagda. She stands astride a stream, basically, and the Dagda mates with her while she's standing astride the stream, and therefore she's the mother of the gods. But she does have this rather scary, kind of like a crow, raven goddess characteristic on the battlefield. She also is associated with a place, Owen Agas, the Cave of Cats, in Roscommon in Ireland, out of which many monsters from the otherworld would come. It would be a fairly dangerous gateway to the otherworld, and she is very much associated with that. So I would say that is probably as clear. I mean, there are lots of characters in the texts that are not good characters, but I wouldn't say that they were necessarily like that.
So do we have, like the Sharon and the Geeks, do we have an image of her in the cemeteries or the churches, or
No.
That's why I can't find it?
No, there are very few representations that are named, and so you find in the archaeology, you find very few that are named. You know, so you'll find like the Mistress of Beasts, for example, that kind of motif on a lot of the stones and the inscriptions, but they very rarely have a name associated with them. And the truth is, because they were all, almost all, with the exception possibly of the Morrigan and Bridget, they were almost all so tribally relevant and so located, and so they would have different names in different places. It's almost like it's not going to happen. You know?
That's good. I
Yeah, I
thought I
don't
was
miss
doing
anything.
something wrong. I needed another word, but you've answered that question. Thank you so much. Great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for hosting. And thank you for your understandings and knowledge that you're sharing tonight. I am struck by the tale of the Fisher King and the wells that are fed by the earth themselves. That story reminds me so much of what I discovered this summer in exploring my Sicilian lineage with Lake Pergusa in the center of Sicily and the myth of Persephone as we more commonly know, but there are layers and layers of culture and history that precede that Greek-Roman, Greco-Roman layer. But the story is very similar, you know, that lake being fed from the earth and the descent of the feminine, be it by rape or, you know, the descent, the intentional descent. And it leaves me wondering ever more around the question of the language and the story of the land and what the land speaks. And then as we in our worldviews, how we may understand or approach that story. And as if, you know, two human languages meeting and finding a translation or bridges between what your perspective is around how we may understand. I'm not entirely sure no problem. So I'm going to just a moment. Sure. Yeah.
Could you rephrase it?
Yeah, definitely. So in make sure I continue. I want to get very okay. So in so many cultures around the world and so many practices, modern and ancient, throughout human experience, there are individuals in the culture, shamans, medicine people, however, who may speak the language of the earth or be in that communication, a potential which I'm curious of and I feel maybe we all hold. But as someone who has grown up through a Western perspective, growing up in the United States of America, and before that even a European lineage, I think that I've probably lost touch with how to be in that conversation. So when I look at mythology and folklore from all around the world, I'm interpreting it through this Western lens. And so I may be distanced from what the earth is speaking because of the layers of culture that are between that voice and my experience. So in honoring that observation you've shared around the emphasis around Greco-Roman mythology, compared to other stories that bring us life and contact with the more than human world. I'm curious on your perspective around the voice of the earth and the interpretation through our worldviews.
Yeah, I think...
Mike, use the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. If I start coughing again, then I'm just going to leave the room. I'm so sorry. I don't know that there are any particular clues in the mythology here, because they just show us a world in which those questions wouldn't have needed to be asked. And you know that the earth had a voice, the otherworld had a voice, the animals had a voice, the rocks had a voice, the hills and the mountains, and it was just all so entwined that I think that they are showing us a worldview clearly before all of the things that happened, the Enlightenment, Christianity and everything served to distance us from that voice. And you know, there are all kinds of practical techniques that we can all do to try and reconnect ourselves with the land. But I don't really see any particular kind of like practical response I can give to you, other than just to say it was there. It was there for a very, very long time. The period in which we've lost it is a very, very short time. And I think that reading these stories, becoming aware of these myths, delving more deeply into the archetypal images and characters and just sitting with them for a while without trying to classify them and confine them and define them in the way that we do, but just exploring them, thinking what they might have meant to people back in that day, almost lifts us out of this worldview that we have and makes it possible to see through the eyes of our ancestors. Does that make sense? It's going to have a very adequate answer to a very good question, but that's what they do for me. It's just a question of sitting with them, of looking at the context, and of trying not to overly define and confine them at the beginning. Thank you. Okay.
So, my name is Maggie Rose, and in addition to being in the East-West Side department here, I'm a Celtic fairy faith practitioner. And one of the things that Craig talks a lot about is finding the guiding myth for our life. And the myth that's come to me as I wrote my dissertation was the myth of, and I'm going to botch the Welsh, so please bear with me, Cailleach and Gwynapneith and Gwaithera grow up. And she's a very tricksy sovereignty goddess to find out about. The resources I've been able to find on her are fairly limited, and so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about her myth and some of the resources you might have on.
I'm so sorry. I've read it, but I don't know any more about it. The problem with a lot of these old stories is that there are no more resources. You know, so in the Welsh tradition, for example, if something is recorded in the collection of tales that we call the Mabinogion, the only other place to go for insight into that would be in the Welsh triads. You know, the kind of sets of 3 lines where sometimes they gave information, or the poetry, particularly the poetry of Taliesin. But if a lot of the characters that are so evocative, there literally is nothing else. It's like one of the characters that people so want to know about in the Mabinogion is Arianrhod. And you know, many practitioners of all kinds of things called her all kinds of things. She may or may not have been. All we know from the Mabinogion is that she gave birth to a set of twins, and she lived by herself and she wasn't married, and that's all we know about her, except for some vague reference to her having a particular castle in the Triad. So a lot of this information literally does not exist anywhere else. And it's very, very frustrating because we could tell that there must have been all kinds of wonderful threads and layers and layers and layers, but we don't have it. So I'm so sorry, that's one I'm not hugely familiar with, but the generality in Welsh mythology is always the same, unless you pick it up in folklore. And this is the other important thing, you know, that a lot of the stuff that we're finding is from texts. But if the stories have been living traditions, then the best places to look is to see if they occur in folk tales of particular regions, because like the Irish tradition, the Welsh tradition is also very place-focused, and so a lot of the stories are told, you know, to have taken place in specific localities on particular hills, which, you know, you could still look at today. So that's the only other suggestion I'm going to take. Thank you.
Hi. How's it going? So my question is, I'm just curious, since you're here right now, the story that you told of the Well Maidens and the Fisher King. There's the human king, whose name I can't remember right now, who, you know, the human king who comes in kind of proceeds to not be able to have that kind of discernment that the king is supposed to have. And I'm wondering if, you know, he was supposed to be put in place by the goddess of sovereignty of his tribe or wherever he was living. If there's any information around that piece of the story, if he was a king who was put in place by a goddess of sovereignty, like how that may have fallen out, how that sort of like within the goddess of sovereignty, how that the sort of like naming of the wrong person, or if like someone who so clearly like lacked that discernment, or if that happened afterwards, or just if there's any kind of information around that.
Okay, there isn't, again, unfortunately. He only appears in that one story, and this is the only story. Except that there is an older story from the Irish tradition, which is why I said that probably it all began there, where Bran, good old Bran, appears again, and his men discover that there is a well at the bottom of which a great treasure lies, which is guarded by otherworldly women, and they go down there, they steal the treasure. The idea is that they probably didn't behave very well, although it's not specified, and then instead of the wasteland, the well actually springs up and floods Bran's kingdom, which then became Loch Foyle. So there are stories, and Bran would have been a king as well. So there are stories where kings who clearly at the beginning looked good on paper, actually then began, as humans do, to make bad decisions. You know, whether that's the corruption of power or whatever it is, isn't often indicated. But there is never any sense in any of this mythology that any of the otherworldly deity characters are all-knowing. They don't have that kind of, transcendental God kind of all-knowing. It's just they go on what they see, what their instincts are, and of course humans change and humans fail them. So it's really very frustrating that is the only place where that story is recorded. So much was lost. But Amongon is his name, and I've researched that too, and I've not come across an Amongon anywhere else.
Is there a sense of who the goddess of sovereignty was, who put Amongon in place or anything? And is there any sense from any of the stories either that if, in any other case, if someone who was named to be king, broke their kind of vow or agreement or discernment or whatever, that they could be dethroned?
Yes. Yes. It normally happens. There are situations where kings fall out of favour with the goddesses of sovereignty. For major transgressions like that one, there are either wastelands or inundations. The world is flooded, or the world becomes a wasteland. But yeah, it is quite common that a ruler is set in place and then doesn't fulfil his obligations for whatever reason.
Thank you. Hi.
So I'm a folk song chaser, and the last place that I just came from was Ireland and Scotland, and so I got to travel, but very much following the music, and I'm a violinist, and so I was finding myself in lots of fiddle jams and folk jams. But I was also doing workshops helping people metabolize their pain for the world and using Joanna Macy's work. And so I've studied philosophy and appreciate the archetypal eye and how we can understand ways of relating to myth and land in ways that help wake us up and shape us up for what's happening right now. And I'm curious. I haven't heard you mention song yet, but I know obviously with folk tales there's usually songs as well, and having gone so deep into this cosmology that is so land-based and place-based, just your thoughts or your discoveries around. I think of Ireland now and I think of the fiddle tunes that I learned. And so I'm just curious, the relationship of song or music to any of that, to anything that you've gone into, whether it's, this goddess came and sung a song, or, as someone who's interested in, how do we relate to the land, to each other, to our empowerment, to healing, and who's a musician who carries song and chases them in the world, and is interested in how music helps us do that too, in this Celtic mythology, in a place where folk music traditions are still so alive, and that is a lovely, healthy thing. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a completely different subject there. I'm so sorry. Folk songs is a different type of folklore, and I'm looking at it from myth and oral narrative folklore. And so folk songs would have a completely different trajectory and detail, but they spring from the same source. Of course they do. They all spring from people's relationship with the land. What is very, very clear in Ireland particularly is that the language and the land and the music are all intertwined, and they're seen, so the stories that are told, the music, the song, is almost seen as an expression of the voice of the land, or the relationship between people and the land in a way that is very deep. So all I can really offer you is generalities. The thing that's interesting in the cosmology, though, to the extent that we can discern it, is that there was a very, very strong belief in the power of voice. So I'm not so much talking about fiddle music, but certainly songs. There was a belief that words said or sung in the right way at the right time, often by standing in a particular way as well, a kind of like ritual stance, would actually change the world. And that's why the bards and the filly were believed to, to be able by power of a satire to literally, not just to embarrass the king out of his kinghood, but literally to change the circumstances. So, all of that is tied up with it, but it's not really my area of expertise.
No, but even just that, what you just shared, like, that's so interesting. So you mentioned otherworldly women shape-shifting into water birds and horses, and I mostly grew up hearing stories about mermaids and selkies, these kind of human fish creatures, and I was just wondering, and I actually also just came back from traveling in Ireland, and I didn't hear as much about them as I expected, and I was wondering, are they less common, but they're popularized here, or like, what's their place in there?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is where we have the split between myth and folklore to the extent that we can do that. And so, if I call myth the kind of literary tradition, and the tradition that is seeking to be more explanatory, has more of the cosmology behind it, then we tend to find the animals that I've talked about. We tend to find birds, and we tend to find horses. If we go into folklore, which very much the stories of the people, and we go around the coast, and we see all of these stories spring from the animals that people are actually interacting with, and of course they're seeing seals every day, and so their stories, the folklore, the stories are going to be about seals because those are the animals that they interact with. So in the oral folk tradition, there are many, many stories about seals and selkies. And sometimes about fish as well, fish women, although fewer, and mermaids. And a mermaid would be very similar in concept to a selkie. So we see that a lot in the folk tradition, but we don't see it in the old mythology, we don't see it in the old literary texts. And I don't know why that is, except that I think that because those are, in a sense, myth is intended to be weightier than folklore. We have very weighty animals. We have animals that clearly represent the other world, like the water birds that take into account the 3 different zones, and horses that are believed to fly to the other world, whereas a seal would be seen as a common garden kind of creature, and not necessarily the subject of myth, but more of folklore. If that makes sense. Thank you. You don't have to agree with it, but that's just how it is.
Hello. I love the idea about nature speaking to us through these different creatures and through plants and trees and mountains. I'm wondering if you can recommend any work that focuses on that through myth and through storytelling.
In the Celtic tradition, I cannot. It really hasn't been done, apart from my own book, which is specifically on women. There are a lot of papers, academic articles that look at elements of plants and trees and what have you. But that's a huge body of evidence. Is there anything specific you're looking at?
I'm just thinking about ecotherapy and how learning to listen to nature. We can learn how to live in balance today, how nature has all the answers. And by learning to listen, we can heal, so to speak.
Sure, and my approach to ecotherapy has always been from a storytelling perspective, because that's just my own background, and both from when I was practicing psychologist as well as an academic, and so I would have been, when I was practicing, telling people those stories out in the land to say, look, there is a crow. Here is a story about our ancestors and their relationship with crows and what the crows said to our ancestors, and to try and use that kind of enchantment to connect people that way. So that would be my own particular approach to it.
Thanks for sharing that.
But telling stories out in the land, I think, is a very, very powerful way of actually making them real to people, bringing it right back down to earth, literally.
What you just said actually segues right into my question, Dr. Blackie, because I would love to hear you speak a little bit about writing right now and its relationship with enchantment.
About writing, what kind of writing? I'm sorry, I'm reading this broader than I can.
Any kind of writing as a way into enchantment.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting question because I was in Santa Fe a couple of weeks ago before coming across to California, running a workshop there, and I spent some time with David Abraham, who we had a very fascinating day talking about a lot of these issues. David's perspective on the world is that writing has a very particular, powerful magic, which if used well, it can be very wonderful, but if we're not careful, because we tend to use it to define and confine things and overly categorize things, it can take us out of enchantment, and that actually the oral tradition, sitting and telling stories to trees and what have you, telling stories outside in the land, is more likely to be enchanting. As someone who found her way to the land in part through writing, I agree with it and I don't at the same time, because I think that one of the things that words can do is cast that particular spell that conjures up images that just help us to see the world in a different way. And so to me there is a role for both, for the oral tradition, for stories being passed on, changing, being told in the land, and also for the very concentrated, pure image that comes from writing a poem or comes from writing a story. One of the ways that I love to do it, and have done recently with my latest book, Foxfire Wolfskin, which is actually fairy tale reimaginings, is to take some of those old stories that I've been talking about and say, for example, what would if the Cailleach were here today, what would she do? Of course, the Cailleach is here today, but that's another story. If she were to turn up today, what would she do? You know, would she look around her in despair? Would the Cailleach ever despair? You know, what would in a world of global warming? Maybe we could rehabilitate the Snow Queen. You know, what relevance would the Snow Queen? So that whole idea of taking these old characters, taking these old archetypes, and imagining them is something so that we can just see a different way of being, a different way of reimagining ourselves. Is to me the power of writing, whereas the power of story of the oral tradition is in a very much more visceral kind of animal way. It ties us back into the land. If that makes sense.
Yeah, this is great because I think a lot about the kind of responsibility that writers bear today in the world that we're a part of today.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's just hard to stand. I can't stand well. Before my friend picked me up, I fell in my hallway, hit my head, hit my knee.
You want a chair, Callie?
No. And then I cried a little, and then I got up like a Cailleach. But she's my gal. I wrote about her for my master's here in the Women's Spirituality Department. I just want to thank you for being here. It's wonderful, especially you talk so much about the Cailleach. Excuse me, and the imaginal. Because I was just talking with my friend Megan at dinner, and that's my dissertation I'm working on, which was going to be about different goddesses and that, but now it's all about death and grief because my son died 8 years ago. And the archetypal and the mythic and the liminal and blah, 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 you know. But it seems the whole thread that runs through it all is this imaginal or otherworldly realm, you know. The deeper I go and just sort of open up, that's what seems to connect it all. And I just wondered if that's what, you're proposing. Like that we try to open up and welcome and engage with the imaginal, or other worlds that are just intertwined with ours, as you said.
Yes, absolutely. I think what's interesting about the Celtic imagination, though, again to stress, is it's very much an embodied imagination.
Yes.
And I think that that is something we very much need. If we look at the history of the imagination over the last 2,000 years, it's been gradually more and more disembodied. It's been an intellectualized, so that now we think what's imaginal is inside our heads. Whereas the Celtic imagination, if I can call it that, because the old world and the imaginal zones are so absolutely entwined and entangled with the land and with our places and with animals and the creatures on it, then it gives us that kind of, literally it brings the imagination back down to earth, where it probably would have been 2,000 years ago before Plato and his cronies and everybody ever afterwards inside our heads. So yes, I'm absolutely passionate about that.
Yes, and doing that, like, I'm telling you now, like doing that, whatever way you do it, you know, whether it's the writing or like druidry or fairy seership or shamanic journey or writing poems or just singing songs. I used to just sing little songs all the time since I was little. You know, and I'd walk out at night as a teenager and sing, and I still sing. It's like the cauldron in your head, the Celtic thing. Like mine was always sort of opened, and then it like really got open. And like stuff just comes through me. You know, and of course, like in a lot of like pagan, you know, religious, spiritual contexts, you know, you can't just say, oh, I had a revelation, you know what I mean? Because we know what revelations can do, you know? They can find and destroy everything. They have that much power. But also, you know, they call it unverified personal gnosis, you know, UPG. But that is not to say that there isn't a lot of wisdom there, you know? I've had things like, I'm a poet too, and then I did, when one of my classes started, I did research, and I found out my grandparents are from County Clare. I've never been there yet. I want to go, although I'm pretty gimpy right now, so we'll see. But, I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, I did a lot of genealogical research, and I forget the name of one of the ancient kingship sites. And my family was like the Bards, like for centuries associated with this one seat of high kingship. And I said, that's where it comes from, you know? Like, and it's still, I feel like it's in me, you know? Like there's something, like if we open to it, like there's something waiting to greet us. And it is embodied though, you know? Like you go talk to trees and stones and whatever, you know, go sit by the river, listen to the wind and, you know, howl at the moon. I howl at public offense. Excuse me. I want to say one little thing for you, okay? May I? It's short, okay? This is what I'm talking about. Okay. Of carriage, wind, and cauldron born, rebirthed, my soul was so forlorn. Her woods were dark, her mysteries deep. And now her secrets I do keep. And now her secrets I do keep. That's Chalquist. I just want to sing something for you to honor you.
Thank you, Patty.
Because it's Celtic Otherworld.
Thank you, Patty. That was perfect. Perfect way to end. I had invited Patty to remain in her seat, but she's stoic.
I want to stand like a collie.
Are there any other elders here who could not stand up and who would like to ask a question for? Okay. Oh. On that note, literally, Patty, I'd like to thank you very much, Dr. Sharon Blackie, Mr.